3 years after a judge brought down a gavel and turned Noah Jennings into Noah Porter, a letter found its way to the house in Chestnut Hill. No return address. Just a name, written by hand in the corner of the envelope. The letters shaking so badly you almost had to guess at them. Harold Jennings. The man who had once set his son down on a bench in a train station, said, "I love you," and walked away. There are stories we think have closed the moment a child finds a home. But sometimes that's only half the story. Because when a person lets go, the child falls and someone else catches them, while the one who let go is still standing there, hands empty, learning how to keep living with the hole he made. This is Harold's story. The man who has to find a way to live with what he did. This is Brian's story. The man who believed he'd already healed, until a thin envelope landed on his desk and woke a fear he had never dared to name. And this is the story of a 7-year-old boy who will have to decide on his own what to do about a father who left him when he isn't even old enough yet to understand the full weight of that word. Left. Before we begin, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll answer honestly in the comments. If it were you, would you open that letter? Or would you leave it sitting in a drawer forever? If you want to walk with us to the end of this journey, hit subscribe, because what the letter opens up won't stop at a single letter. In March, the first warm days after a long winter, Harold started going down to the center's woodshop. On the ground floor, behind the kitchen, was a small shop with a few workbenches, a rack of tools hung on the wall, and the smell of sawdust always hanging in the air. It was where the people in recovery learned a trade, or simply found something to do so their hands wouldn't be idle, thinking about the things they used to hold. Harold had been a good carpenter once. Before Eliza, before Noah, before everything fell apart, his hands knew wood the way they knew a mother tongue. The first time he picked up a hand plane after 3 years, his hands shook so badly he almost dropped it. But he set it down on the wood, pushed one pass, and the muscles remembered. The second pass was steadier. By the 10th, the shaking was gone, and for the first time in a long while, his mind went quiet. That was the part he hadn't expected. When he worked the wood, the voice in his head, the one that reminded him every day that he was the man who abandoned his child, softened. It didn't vanish, it just softened enough for him to breathe. Thomas Brennan, the master carpenter who ran the shop, a 70-year-old man with hands rough as bark, stood watching Harold one afternoon. "You've got the trade in you," he said. "Your hands know the work. Shame to waste it." "I've wasted plenty already," Harold answered, not stopping. "Then don't waste this one too," Thomas said, and walked off, not preaching a word more. Harold started with small things: a picture frame, a pencil box, then a stool. Each finished piece gave him back something he'd thought was gone for good, the feeling that his hands could still make something good in the world. One afternoon, Dr. Morgan stopped by the shop. Harold was sanding the top of a small table, walnut, the grain running in dark brown lines pretty as flowing water. "That's beautiful," she said, laying a hand on the wood. "Who's it for?" Harold stopped. He looked at the table as if seeing it for the first time. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm just making it." "Maybe you're making it for him," she said gently. "One day, when you're ready, you could give him something made by your own hands. Something that says, 'Even when I wasn't there, I was thinking about you the whole time.'" Harold shook his head, his throat tightening. "He won't take anything from me." "Maybe not now," she said. "But people change, Harold. And sometimes forgiveness comes from a place we never expect. Just finish the table. The rest can wait." In October, Dr. Morgan gave Harold an assignment. "I want you to write a letter to Noah," she said. "You don't have to send it. Maybe you never will. But I want you to put it down, in words, the things you'd want to say to him." "I don't know where to start," Harold said.
Start with the truth.
"Start with the truth." It took him 3 weeks. Every night he sat at the wooden desk in his room with a sheet of paper and a pen. Some nights he filled a whole page and then tore it up because he caught himself making excuses. Some nights he managed only a single sentence and then sat staring at it for hours. Finally, on a bitterly cold November night, he finished it. "Dear Noah, you'll never read this letter. I know that. But I still need to write it. Every night before I fall asleep, I wonder what you're doing. Whether you're sleeping well, whether someone reads you a story before bed, whether your leg still hurts, or whether the therapy has made it easier. I hope you're happy. I hope you have a family that loves you the way I couldn't. There are days I hope you've forgotten me entirely, because remembering me means remembering the bench at that station, and I don't want you carrying that. But if you do remember, I'm asking you to know this one thing. I didn't leave you because I didn't love you. I left you because I loved you too much, and I was too weak to turn that love into something right. That was my failing, not yours. Never yours. Your mother, Eliza, would be angry with me. I think she'd never forgive what I did. And I don't deserve to be forgiven. But you deserve everything good in this world. I hope you have it. I will always love you. Harold, the man who once got to be your father." He folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and set it in the desk drawer. He didn't send it. Writing it healed nothing. But it lifted one small stone off his chest, small enough that for the first time in months, he slept that night without dreaming. While Harold wrestled with the past at Riverside, Noah was growing up in Chestnut Hill. He was 7 now, taller, his leg far steadier after 3 years of physical therapy, though the brace was still there and its faint click still followed him with every step. And his mind still left grown-ups speechless. Every morning, Brian drove Noah to Jefferson Academy, a private school for gifted children in downtown Philadelphia. There, Noah studied math at a level far beyond his age. He saw numbers the way other people saw colors. They had rhythm, they had pattern, they had a hidden order he could see, while grown-ups had to strain to keep up. But the thing Brian was proudest of in Noah wasn't his mind. One afternoon, when Brian came to pick him up, his teacher, Ellen Rodriguez, came out to meet him. "Mr. Porter, I want to tell you about something that happened today," she said, a warm smile on her face. "We had a new boy in class, a little one named Michael. Shy, scared, didn't say a word to anyone all morning." At lunch, Noah carried his tray over and sat down next to him. I overheard him say, "I know what it's like to be the new kid. When I first got here, I was scared too. But everybody here is really nice. You're going to be okay." Brian felt a warmth rise in his chest. "He remembers," he said quietly. "Remembers what?" "What it's like to be the new one, the different one, the one who needs somebody to come sit beside him." On the drive home, Brian asked, "Did you help a new kid today?" Noah nodded. "Yeah, Michael. He was real scared, Dad. Like me before." "You're not scared anymore?" Noah thought for a moment, then answered with the honesty only children have. "I'm still scared sometimes. But I know you and Mom will be there. So I'm okay." Brian had to swallow hard and keep his eyes straight on the road so Noah wouldn't see them go red. But as a child grows, the questions grow too. One night in May, while Brian was reading Noah a bedtime story, the boy suddenly asked, "Dad, why don't I look like you and Mom?" Brian froze. "What do you mean?" "Jamie says he has his dad's nose. Sophia says she has her mom's eyes. But me, I don't look like you. And I don't look like Mom." Brian set the book down, choosing each word carefully. He and Margaret had known this day would come. They had promised each other, and Harold too, that they would never lie to the boy. "You remember I told you that you were adopted, right?" "Yeah. It means you weren't born to me and Mom. But you're still our son. Just in a different way. By choice. We chose you, and we'll choose you every day for the rest of our lives." Noah nodded, thinking, "So I have other parents? The ones who had me?" "You do." Brian spoke very softly. "You have a mother named Eliza. She died when you were born. And you have a father named Harold. Where's Harold now?" Brian hesitated. He knew where Harold was. He and Harold had exchanged a few short letters over the past 3 years, letters he kept tucked away in the library desk and had never mentioned to Noah. But giving a specific address to a 7-year-old was a different thing. "I'm not sure, exactly," he said, a half-truth, and he hated the other half. "He couldn't take care of you anymore, so he asked me to do it for him." "Did he love me?" Brian looked into Noah's blue eyes. They were exactly like Harold's, though he'd never said so out loud. "Yes," he answered, firm. "I believe he loved you, in his own way. But sometimes love isn't enough, Noah. Sometimes a child needs more than love. A safe place. Grown-ups who don't fall apart." Noah was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, his voice so small Brian had to lean in to hear it, "What about you? Are you enough?" Brian pulled him close, his voice shaking. "I'm going to try my hardest to be enough. Every single day of my life." Noah wrapped his arms back around him, small but certain. "You already are." Those words, from a 7-year-old, carried a healing no doctor and no amount of his money could ever buy. In July, on a summer afternoon, Brian received a strange envelope. Not the short letters the two of them usually traded. This envelope was thicker, and on it, in that same shaking hand, was a line Harold had never written before. "Please consider passing this on to Noah if a day comes when you think the time is right." Brian sat in the library, the envelope in his hands. Margaret had taken Noah out shopping. In the big house there was only him and the sound of his own heart loud in his chest. He opened it. Inside was the letter Harold had written at Riverside 3 years earlier. The one never sent, now sent. The ink was smudged in places, as if the writer had wept onto the page. Brian read it once, then again. Each line as heavy as a stone. And then something happened he hadn't braced for, something that shamed him the instant it surfaced. He didn't want to give the letter to Noah. Not because he was afraid it would make Noah sad, because of something darker, more selfish, something he thought he'd buried long ago. He was afraid. Afraid that if Noah read these lines, a door would open inside the boy, a door that led back toward Harold. Afraid that the 3 years he'd spent awake through the night soothing Noah, sitting beside him through every session of physical therapy, learning to be a father a second time after losing Danny, that all of it could be shaken loose by a single letter. He sat with that thought a long time. Outside, the afternoon sun turned gold across the rows of books. Then he thought of Danny. He thought of the final days, when he'd tried everything, every doctor, every dollar, to keep his son. And lost. He thought of how somewhere in this same city there was another man aching to know his child was alive, was okay, was happy. And he, Brian, was the only person on earth who could give that man that. To keep the letter, to guard his own place in Noah's heart, that wasn't loving Noah. That was loving himself. That night, after Noah was asleep, Brian told Margaret. All of it. Even the shameful part. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she took his hand. "What are you really afraid of?" she asked. Brian sighed. "I'm afraid that one day he'll look at me and think, 'You're not my real father.'" "Brian." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Noah knows he's loved. No one can take that from him. Not Harold, not 100 letters. But he also has the right to know where he came from. Not now. He's too little to carry the whole story. But one day, when he asks, you'll need to have this letter to give him. And you'll want to be the man who kept it carefully, not the man who hid it away." Brian bowed his head a long while. "Is it all right if I write back to Harold?" he finally asked. "You should," Margaret said. That night, Brian wrote, "Mr. Jennings, I received your letter, and it took me a long time to decide to answer. Noah is okay. More than okay. He's at a good school, he has friends, and he's discovering a mind I don't have the words to describe. His leg is much steadier now. He laughs a lot. He's kind. Kind in a way that makes me believe that whatever you did, you also passed something decent onto him, somewhere in the blood. He hasn't read your letter. I'm holding on to it. When he's old enough, ready enough, I'll give it to him. That's a promise. I don't know whether you deserve forgiveness. That's not mine to judge. Someday Noah will be grown, and he'll decide that for himself. But I want you to know this. I don't hate you. I lost a son too. I know how far pain can bend a person. Take care of yourself. Keep living. And know that your son is loved. Brian Porter. He mailed it to Riverside the next day. For Noah's 8th birthday, Brian threw a small party at the house. Classmates came, there was cake, there were games, there was children's laughter ringing through the living room, the sound Brian had once thought this house would never hear again after Danny died. But when the guests had gone and the house had quieted, when it was just the two of them sitting beside the pile of unopened presents, Noah asked a question that stopped Brian cold. "Dad, does Harold know it's my birthday today?" Brian pulled a chair over and sat beside his son. "Are you thinking about him?" Noah nodded, his eyes on an unopened gift. "I was just wondering if he remembers me, or if he's forgotten." This was the moment Brian had been dodging for months. He took a deep breath. "He hasn't forgotten you," he said. "I know that for certain." "How do you know?" "Because he's written to me, asking about you, more than once." Noah whipped his head around. "Really, Dad?" "Really." And I wrote back. I told him you're happy. Brian paused. He also sent a letter. For you. I've been keeping it. Noah went quiet for a long time, longer than an 8-year-old usually can. "Can I read it?" Brian hesitated. "Are you sure? That letter, it might make you sad." "I want to know," Noah said. His voice was small, but it held the kind of resolve only children who've been hurt seem to have. Brian went into the library, took the letter out of the desk, and came back to sit beside his son. Noah read slowly, his lips moving with each word. Brian watched his face and saw it change from curiosity to something he couldn't read, and then the tears began to fall. But they weren't the tears he'd expected. Noah set the letter down, and when he looked up, his face wasn't sadness. It was anger. The first anger Brian had ever seen in him. "Why did he leave me there?" Noah asked, his voice breaking. "He said he loved me. If he loved me, why did he leave me alone on that bench? I waited. I waited for him to come back. I told the bear that Daddy was coming back. But he didn't come back." Brian said nothing. He didn't fill the silence with quick comfort. He just pulled his son close and let him cry. "You're allowed to be angry," he said softly after a while. "You can be angry as long as you need to be. What he did to you was wrong. No letter makes it right. Being angry doesn't make you a bad kid. It makes you a kid who knows he should have been kept." Noah cried into his chest a long time. Then, when the crying eased, he said, his voice small and tired, "I want to ask him, why? You want to meet him?" "I don't know." Noah wiped his face. "I want to and I don't want to. I'm mad at him, but I also want to see his face. I want him to see I'm okay. I want him to know I'm fine, even without him." Brian heard that and understood this was no longer about him. This was Noah's journey to find some kind of peace inside the story of his own life. And the job of a good father, sometimes, isn't to keep his child away from pain. It's to walk with him into the pain and stand there. "If that's what you want," he said, "I'll set it up. And whatever you decide when you see him, angry or not angry, or you change your mind and don't want to go after all of it is okay. I'll be right there." 2 weeks later, Brian called Riverside Recovery Center and asked to speak with Harold. Harold's voice came through the receiver, shaking, scared, but clear in the way of a man who'd gotten back up many times. "Noah wants to meet you," Brian said. On the other end was a silence so long, Brian thought the line had dropped. I don't deserve it," Harold finally got out, his voice breaking. "Maybe not," Brian answered plainly. "But this isn't about whether you deserve it. This is what the boy needs. And I need to tell you something first, so you're ready." "What?" "He's angry with you. He read the letter, and he's angry. He's going to ask you why. He might cry, he might yell, he might say things that are hard to hear. And if that happens, you don't get to defend yourself. You don't get to lay out your own suffering to make him pity you. You let him be angry. You take it. That's the only thing you can do for him right now." Harold was silent. Then, through a choked sob, he said, "I'll let him be angry. I promise. I won't run anymore." They chose to meet at Holy Cross Cemetery, where Eliza was buried. A neutral place, a place where all three of them, Brian, Harold, and Noah, stood before the same loss. The day came on a late November afternoon. Cold, gray, the same weather as the day Harold had left Noah at the station 3 years before. Brian didn't say the coincidence out loud, but he knew Harold felt it too. There are days in the year that carry the weight of other days. Brian drove slowly into the cemetery. Noah sat in the passenger seat, quiet, holding the stuffed bear, the old one from the station bench, which Margaret had found in storage and washed soft again. "Are you scared?" Brian asked. "A little," Noah admitted. I'm still mad, but I still want to see him. Both of those at the same time is fine, Brian said. You don't have to pick one. Harold was waiting near a row of pines, a few steps off the path. He was much older than the man in Brian's memory. White hair, his back slightly bent, his face lined from the hard years. But his eyes were different, clearer, more awake, like the eyes of a man who had been through the darkest place and come back. Noah got out of the car, still gripping Brian's hand. Father and son walked toward him. Harold opened his mouth, but no sound came at first. Finally, he said, his voice nearly broken, "Noah, you've gotten so big." Noah didn't answer the greeting. He looked straight at the man in front of him, and the first thing he said was not a hello, and not forgiveness. "Why did you leave me on that bench?" Harold staggered as if shoved. Brian saw him nearly buckle, but he didn't defend himself. He didn't bring up Eliza, the bills, the illness, the desperation. Not now, not to shield himself. He knelt down to the boy's eye level and said the truest thing he had. "Because I was wrong, and I was a coward. You waited for me to come back, and I didn't come back. And there is no reason on this earth good enough to justify that. You did nothing wrong, Noah. It was all my fault." Noah stood still. His eyes, exactly like Eliza's, filled with tears. But he didn't cry. He was trying to hold something very large inside a very small body. "I waited for you," he said. "I told the bear you were coming back. I believed it." "I know," Harold whispered. Tears ran down his hollow face. "I'll live with that for the rest of my life." They stood there a long while, no one speaking. The wind moved through the pines. Then, without a word, Harold rose and led all three of them to Eliza's headstone. He laid down a bouquet. "This is your mother," he said quietly. "She was the best person I ever knew. And you were what she wanted more than anything in the world." Noah looked at the name carved into the stone. Eliza Jennings. A last name he no longer carried. "Dad, Brian said she died so I could live," he said softly. "That's right." Harold nodded, his voice catching. Noah was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked another question. Not an angry one this time, but a real one. The question of a child trying to put together the picture of his own life. "Do you regret saving me? Since saving me meant losing her?" Harold looked him straight in the eye. "No," he said, and his voice didn't waver for an instant. "I have never once regretted that you got to live, not for a single second. What I regret is what came after, that I wasn't strong enough to be worthy of the life she traded for yours." Noah looked at him a long time. Brian stood a few steps back, not intervening, letting this moment belong to the two of them. And then Noah did something that took Brian's breath away. He didn't hug Harold. He didn't say, "I forgive you." He only stepped a little closer, close enough that Harold could have reached out. But he kept the stuffed bear held between them like a small boundary. "I haven't forgiven you," Noah said. His voice was calm, clear, honest enough to hurt both grown men. "I don't know if I can. I'm still mad. But..." He paused, searching for the words. "But I don't want to hate you. Hating is so tiring."
You sounded so sad in your letter. So I don't hate you. I just haven't forgiven you. Those two things are different, right? He turned to Brian. They are, Brian said, and his voice broke too. Those two things are very different, and you don't have to rush either one. Harold nodded, tears falling without stop. You've put it better than anything I came up with in 3 years, he said. Be angry. Be angry as long as you need. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere again. And if there's a day you still can't forgive me, that's all right too. You don't owe me forgiveness. You don't owe me anything. Noah looked at him, then down at the bear in his hands. He thought for a moment, the way he thought when he stood in front of a hard math problem. Then he held the bear out, not to give it away, just to let Harold see it. I still have this bear, he said, from that bench. I didn't get rid of it. Harold looked at the bear, and a sound escaped him, half a sob and half a laugh, the sound of a man handed back a piece of the past he'd believed was lost forever. Thank you, he whispered, for keeping it, and for coming today. They didn't embrace. There was no moment of complete reconciliation under the pines. There were only 3 people standing before a grave, each carrying a different grief, and a small door that had just cracked open, not fully, but no longer shut tight. On the drive home, Noah stared out the window a long time. Then he said, Dad, yeah, I think I'm going to write to him. Not because I forgive him, because I still have a lot of questions. Is that okay? Brian looked at his son in the rearview mirror and smiled, even as his eyes stung. Of course, he said. Ask as many questions as you need, and I'll always be right here, whatever the answers turn out to be. There are stories that end with an embrace under the pines, with the words, I forgive you, with a family reunited whole in the sunlight. This is not one of those stories. This story ends with an 8-year-old sitting at the kitchen table, chewing the end of a pencil, writing a letter to the father who left him. A letter full of questions that have no answers yet. It ends with a man at Riverside opening that envelope, reading the scrawled child's handwriting, and weeping. Not because he's been forgiven, but because for the first time in 3 years, he's been allowed to keep talking to his son. It ends with a different father in Chestnut Hill, standing outside the kitchen doorway, watching his boy write, and learning something that love sometimes asks of us. That loving a child doesn't mean keeping him for yourself, but being steady enough to let his heart have room for more than one person. Forgiveness isn't a moment. It's a road. And there are roads people walk their whole lives without reaching the end. But the walking was the thing that mattered. Harold didn't ask for his parental rights back. He didn't ask to live with them. He only asked to keep writing letters, and Noah allowed it. The boy's letters were still full of hard questions, and Harold answered every one, honestly, even when the truth hurt him. Because he'd understood, in the end, that the greatest gift he could give his son wasn't a wooden box or a perfect apology. It was the truth, handed over a little at a time, with enough patience to wait for the child to decide what he wanted to do with it. And maybe that's what this story wants to leave with you, that those left behind after a loss, the one who let go as much as the one who caught the fall,
each carry a weight of their own. That a child has the right to love and to be angry at the same person at once, and both of those are true. That forgiveness can't be forced, can't be bought, can't be handed over just because a grown-up wants his own story to have a pretty ending. Forgiveness, if it comes, will come on its own time. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do, whether the father who left, the father who stayed, or an 8-year-old standing between the two of them, is to keep sitting back down at the table, picking up the pencil, and writing the next question. If this story touched you even a little, leave a comment. I want to ask you this. Is there anyone in your life you haven't been able to forgive, but no longer want to hate either? That in-between place, where it isn't hatred, but isn't yet peace, is a very human place to stand. And if you believe that some wounds take a lifetime to heal, but are still worth beginning to heal, hit subscribe and walk with us through more journeys like this one.